By the time Days of Wine and Roses reached theaters in 1962, audiences were stunned. This wasn't the Jack Lemmon they were used to. Gone was the light-footed charmer, the nervous romantic, the lovable screw-up. In his place stood a man unraveling in real time, his charm corroded by dependency, his optimism collapsing under the weight of addiction. For many actors, such a role would have been a career risk. For Lemmon, it was an exposure. The film follows Joe Clay's descent into alcoholism with unflinching honesty. There are no heroic speeches. No dramatic redemption arcs. Just a slow erosion of dignity, love, and self-control. And what made it unbearable to watch was how recognizable it felt. Because audiences weren't just watching Joe Clay fall apart. They were watching Jack Lemmon tell the truth. So here's the uncomfortable question. When an actor's pain makes a performance unforgettable, are we witnessing bravery or exploitation? Alcohol as armor. Jack Lemmon never drank to be reckless. He drank to function. Alcohol became the thing that allowed him to relax, to soften the internal tension that had followed him since childhood. It quieted the voice that told him he had to be on at all times. It dulled the fear that if he stopped performing, emotionally or professionally, everything would collapse. In Hollywood, drinking wasn't just accepted. It was encouraged. Deals were made over cocktails. Friendships were forged at bars. Long shooting days ended in long nights. Saying no felt like weakness. And Lemmon, who had spent his entire life avoiding being seen as weak, rarely said no. But dependence is rarely loud at first. It whispers. It convinces you that you're still in control. That you deserve this. That everyone else is doing it too. And before you realize what's happened, the thing you leaned on has become the thing holding you down. So ask yourself, how many people around us are quietly using something? Work, humor, success, substances, to keep themselves from falling apart. Success without safety. By the mid-1960s, Lemmon was everywhere. He worked relentlessly, moving from one demanding role to the next. His collaborations with Billy Wilder became legendary. Irma La Douse, The Fortune Cookie, Avanti. Wilder understood Lemmon in a way few directors ever had. He saw past the comedy. He recognized the sadness. Wilder once said that Lemmon could break your heart with a smile. And that wasn't an accident. It was a skill forged in survival. But success didn't bring safety. If anything, it increased the pressure. Jack Lemmon had become a symbol. Dependable, lovable, bankable. Studios relied on him. Co-stars trusted him. Audiences expected him. And expectations can be suffocating. What happens when your identity becomes a product? When your value feels conditional on your ability to deliver joy? Lemmon once admitted that applause scared him more than silence. Because applause ends. And silence feels like abandonment. The second marriage and the illusion of stability. In 1962, Lemmon married actress Felicia Farr. On the surface, it looked like the stability he'd always lacked. The couple welcomed a daughter, Courtney, in 1966, and for a time, Lemmon appeared calmer, more grounded. But appearances were deceiving. Lemmon loved deeply, but he loved anxiously. He feared disappointing the people closest to him. He feared being emotionally absent the way his parents had been. And yet, the very tools he used to cope, work, alcohol, emotional deflection, often created distance instead of closeness. How do you show up fully for others when you've spent your entire life hiding parts of yourself? Fatherhood brought joy, but also terror. Because now there was something to lose. The breaking point. By the early 1970s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Lemmon's drinking intensified. His mood swung unpredictably. Friends noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. Directors noticed his increasing reliance on alcohol to get through shoots. And then came the moment that changed everything. One night, after a heavy drinking binge, Lemmon collapsed. His body, so disciplined, so driven, finally refused to keep pace with his denial. The diagnosis was clear. If he didn't stop drinking, it would kill him. Not someday. Soon. This wasn't a metaphor. It was an ultimatum. So here's the question no one likes to ask. Why does it often take the threat of death for people to choose themselves? Choosing to live. Jack Lemmon entered recovery quietly. No press tours. No dramatic confessions. No public redemption arc. He didn't want applause for surviving. He just wanted to survive. Sobriety forced him to confront what alcohol had been numbing for decades. The loneliness, the fear of abandonment, the belief that love was conditional. Recovery didn't make him cheerful. It made him honest. And that honesty changed his work forever. A new kind of performance. In the years that followed, Lemmon's roles grew darker, more complex, more fearless. He played men who failed. Men who aged. Men who weren't likable. Men who weren't saved. In Save the Tiger, 1973, he portrayed a garment manufacturer facing moral collapse in a corrupt industry. The performance earned him his second Academy Award, this time for Best Actor. But the win felt different. There was no giddy celebration. Just quiet validation. Because this time, he hadn't hidden behind charm. He had stood naked in his truth. Is there anything more powerful than an artist who no longer needs to be liked? Aging in an industry that fears it. As Hollywood grew younger, faster, louder, Lemmon refused to chase relevance. He didn't reinvent himself with gimmicks. He leaned into age, into regret, into weariness, into wisdom. His later collaborations with Walter Matthau, The Odd Couple, Grumpy Old Men, weren't just comedies. They were meditations on friendship, aging, and the stubborn hope that life could still surprise you. Their chemistry wasn't manufactured. It was lived in. Two men who had survived. Two men who understood disappointment. Two men who knew laughter wasn't the opposite of pain. It was often born from it. Why do stories about aging resonate so deeply? Is it because they remind us that survival itself is an achievement? Reconciling with the past. In his later years, Lemmon spoke more openly about his childhood. About his mother's distance. About the belief that he had to perform to be loved. About the exhaustion of being on all the time. He didn't speak with bitterness. He spoke with clarity. Understanding didn't erase the pain, but it softened it. And perhaps that was the greatest performance of his life. Not on screen, but within himself. Jack Lemmon died on June 27, 2001, at the age of 76. The tributes poured in. Actors praised his versatility. Directors praised his discipline. Audiences praised his warmth. But those who knew him best spoke of something else. His kindness. His humility. His quiet courage. Because Jack Lemmon wasn't just a great actor. He was a man who survived his own story. So when we watch him now, his nervous smiles, his trembling vulnerability, his perfectly timed humor, we're not just watching entertainment. We're watching a human being doing what he learned to do as a child. Holding the world together with a smile. And maybe the real legacy of Jack Lemmon isn't how much joy he gave us. Maybe it's the reminder that even the people who make us laugh the hardest are often fighting battles we never see. So here's the final question. When someone makes the world brighter, do we ever stop to ask what it costs them to do so? And more importantly, do we know how to let them rest? Lemmon later admitted that this film forced him to confront himself. That sentence sits quietly in the memory of his life like a key in a pocket. Small, metal, ordinary, but powerful enough to open a door. Which film? Which moment was the hinge that tipped applause into self-reflection? For Lemmon, it wasn't a single movie so much as a cumulative nudging of roles and choices, a steady drumbeat of parts that asked him, gently and then insistently, to look back at the boy behind the actor. The Oscar nomination he received didn't just recognize his talent. It marked a turning point in his life. It made private questions public. It forced the applause to be measured not only in tickets sold, but in the cost of getting there. Success on screen. Instability at home. Lemmon's professional ascent arrived in the wake of personal cracks. The life that the bright lights built did not always keep the private rooms warm. His first marriage to actress Cynthia Stone had already ended in 1957. They had a son, Chris, a living tether between two people who, by many accounts, loved each other but could not stay together. The separation was not theatrical. It was the slow, ordinary unraveling of two people mismatched in timing, temperament, and need. He later described that period as being trapped in a cycle neither of them knew how to escape. That phrase, trapped in a cycle, is less about blame than about bewilderment. How often does love falter not because of malice but because of misalignment? Have you ever wondered how many people chase success because they don't know how to fix what's broken at home? How many auditions, deals, and accolades are actually attempts at self-salving, at proving to an inner critic that they are worthy of steadiness and acceptance? These questions are not rhetorical in Lemmon's life. They are the shape of his choices. In 1962, the arc bent toward something steadier. He married Felicia Farr in Paris while filming Irma la Douce. Paris, with its light and distance from Hollywood's machinery, became the scene of a quieter revolution. Farr brought stability, kindness, and a kind of soft center. Lemmon became a stepfather to her daughter and later welcomed their own child, Courtney, in 1966. Felicia didn't just marry Jack Lemmon, she helped save him. That's a heavy sentence and not a sacrificial one. Saving someone in a long-term sense rarely looks like a single heroic act. It looks like showing up for breakfast, listening when the phone rings at midnight, tolerating moods and oddities and the small humiliations fame can cause. It looks like allowing someone to be human without needing them to be perfect. What does rescue look like in your life? Is it a dramatic rescue, or the slow, patient work of staying? The friendship that changed everything. In the same year Ridley Scott would have you believe in cinematic lightning bolts, though decades later, Lemmon's life took a smaller but no less seismic turn when he met Walter Matthau while filming The Fortune Cookie. Their chemistry was electric, but it was not the simulated kind, the sort manufactured by casting directors and designer wardrobes. This was an affinity that felt like shared language. Dry, precise, sardonic, but threaded with empathy. Matthau's gruffness and Lemmon's nervous precision formed an odd symmetry. Together they could do with looks what other actors needed pages to express. Matthau won an Oscar for his role. Lemmon found something rarer, a lifelong companion. They made 10 films together. Their families were close. Their politics aligned. Their humor matched. They could be cruel to each other on set in the way that old friends are, with mockery that had the shape of affection. When Matthau died in 2000, Lemmon said it felt like losing part of himself. How often do we get just one person in life who truly understands us? Not a partner, not a manager, not a passive admirer, but that one companion who can finish the sentence you started and laugh at the exact pause you use? The answer, for most of us, is rare. And that rarity makes such friendships holy in their own way. Comedy with shadows underneath. Lemmon's films in the 1960s looked light and playful on paper. Irma la Douce, Under the Yum Yum Tree, Good Neighbor Sam, but almost all of them carried darker undertones. Humor was not a mask for him as much as a prism. Through comedy he could examine anxiety, alienation, desire, and fear. In Irma la Douce, he played a man pretending to be someone else just to feel loved. The charade is almost classical, the old story of impersonation for love, but in Lemmon's hands there was tenderness and a sense of real hurt. Pretending to be a different self is not only a plot device, it is a human strategy. We all put on personas to make ourselves acceptable. Sometimes those roles become the only place we feel safe. Under the Yum Yum Tree, with its unsettling power dynamics, cast him as a charming landlord who used desire as leverage. The film sits uncomfortably in the present day because the subject matter reads differently under a modern lens. But therein lies another truth. Comedy ages, but the anxieties it expresses can remain stubbornly contemporary. Good Neighbor Sam buried its protagonist beneath lies and misunderstandings until he was suffocated by his own attempts to control outcomes. Watching Lemmon in those scenes, you can see how panic can be performed almost as a tic. A hand ringing, a laugh too quick, a voice that cracks. He turned nervousness into a kind of art. Was he choosing these roles? Or were these roles choosing him? There is no single answer. Actors choose, yes, but they are often chosen by studios, by cultural tastes, by the accidental fit between a performer's temperament and a character's needs. Sometimes a role finds an actor exactly when the actor needs to meet their own reflection. Becoming Felix Unger. Then came 1968. The Odd Couple. Felix Unger, anxious, neat, emotionally raw, was Jack Lemmon in many ways. A man terrified of being unwanted. A man who cleaned and organized because chaos frightened him. Felix's neuroses were not just comic fodder. They were a visible architecture of fear. And Lemmon built Felix with a tenderness that allowed audiences to laugh with him rather than at him. The movie became a massive hit. It earned over $44 million. It played for 14 weeks straight at Radio City Music Hall. Lemmon was now one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. But did the applause make the anxiety go away? Or did it make it louder? The Odd Couple made Lemmon famous in a new currency: mass recognition. The neatness of Felix looked like cartoonish eccentricity, but for those who lived with similar tremors, Felix was a mirror. He was proof that neuroses could be humanized and that audiences could find compassion in laughter. The success brought money, yes, but also a new kind of pressure. People recognized him on the street. They expected a persona. When the curtain dropped, who was left standing in the dressing room? When real life became overwhelming. By the 1970s, Lemmon's characters became more frantic, more fragile. There was an honesty to them that felt less like performance and more like excavation. The Out-of-Towners showed a couple crushed by one disaster after another. The film's comedy was a response to the absurdity of modern life. In those roles, Lemmon wasn't just playing panic. He was mapping the soft places where modernity hurts. By this time, Lemmon was drinking heavily again. It is an old pattern. The quiet spiral of moderate use to dependency, the slow onset of behaviors that become a bomb and then a chain. In 1974, he appeared on an awards stage visibly slurred. In 1976, he was arrested for DUI. These episodes were kept largely out of the tabloids at the time, but they were there, like bruises beneath clothing. How many people do you know who seem fine on the outside, while quietly falling apart? It's a question that feels accusatory only if we forget that public personas are carefully constructed. Careers are a kind of armor. The armor can be polished and gleam in interviews, and yet underneath seems tear. For Lemmon, the answer was not hiding. He sought help, retreated when he needed to, and poured his pain back into his work. Those choices would reshape the latter part of his career, turning pain into power. Instead of retreating, Lemmon turned inward, and his performances deepened. In The Prisoner of Second Avenue, he played a man crushed by unemployment, crime, and the claustrophobia of urban life. The film looked like a comedy on the surface but was a lament under the skin. Lemmon's performance in the film was a map of small humiliations and wordless terrors. He made the audience feel the familiar nausea of nights spent awake, counting losses. In The China Syndrome, he portrayed a nuclear engineer risking everything to expose the truth. The film was released just days before a real nuclear accident, making it eerily powerful. Art had become prescient. A performance that had always aimed for truth now intersected with real-world fear. These weren't just movies anymore. They were warnings. That is the strange power of cinema. Sometimes it is prophecy, sometimes it is memory, but often it is both. Lemmon's work in this era served as a kind of social barometer. The loss that never healed. One pain Lemmon never fully escaped was the death of his mother. In 1967, he found her dead in her apartment. She was 82. Ill. But the shock of discovering her stayed with him forever. How do you ever truly recover from being the one who finds someone you love gone? The logistics of grief are practical. Calls to make, services to plan, legal things to handle. But the human cost is not logistical. It is a small, persistent darkness that rearranges your interior furniture. For Lemmon, that darkness was a quiet undertow in many later roles. The sadness appeared in his eyes. It softened his comic timing and gave his dramatic beats new weight. He rarely spoke about it, privately protective of that wound, but the presence of loss shaped him. There is a particular kind of reverence in someone who survives such a shock and still chooses to show up on stage. It asks us to consider the courage of continuity. Continuing to work, to laugh, to live after the world has demonstrated that it can take away the ones you love. A second act few actors ever reach. In his late 60s, Lemmon did something most actors only dream of. He staged a late-career renaissance. Glengarry Glen Ross was not the kind of film that required big, sentimental gestures. It demanded precision, a language of desperation and small betrayals. Lemmon delivered one of the greatest performances of his career, a salesman terrified of becoming irrelevant. And in doing so he revealed the deep seam of vulnerability that had always been part of his craft. The irony was painful. He was being celebrated for playing someone afraid of being forgotten. Then came Grumpy Old Men, a warm, hilarious return to form with Mathau. This sequel of sorts to their on-screen partnership let audiences revisit the intimacy they had come to love. It was a reminder that humor can be restorative and that shared laughter can be a balm for old aches. For a moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. One last gift. In 1999, Lemmon took on the role of Maury Schwartz in Tuesdays with Maury, a dying professor reflecting on love, life, and loss. It was quiet, gentle, wise. It felt like Jack Lemmon saying goodbye. He won an Emmy, a Golden Globe, a Screen Actors Guild Award. But more importantly, he gave people something rare: peace. There is an art to playing endings without melodrama. Lemmon possessed it. His performance was an invitation to sit with mortality without flinching, to listen to someone speak about ending as if it were a chapter that could be read aloud and appreciated. The final chapter. That same year, Lemmon was diagnosed with cancer. By 2001, it had spread. On June 27, Jack Lemmon died at 76, surrounded by his family. He was buried beside Walter Matthau. Two men who made the world laugh, now resting together. So what was Jack Lemmon really telling us? Through comedy, through tragedy, through a lifetime of unforgettable roles, Jack Lemmon was quietly asking one question: can we still be kind, even when we are broken? And maybe that's why, even now, when we watch him smile on screen, it feels like he's not just entertaining us. He's reminding us that being human is enough. Extended reflections and scenes. The elements above sketch the arc of a public life: roles, awards, headlines. But a life is not a ledger. It is a room full of small objects: a chipped coffee cup, a ticket stub folded into a wallet, a telephone that rings in the night. In the months after Lemmon's death, conversations with people who had known him revealed the texture of those rooms. Here, where memory stretches beyond summary, we can begin to inhabit the man behind the marquee. A morning in Sherman Oaks. Imagine a morning in the Lemmon household in the mid-1970s. Sunlight thinning through blinds, a radio murmuring the news, the smell of coffee and toast. Jack sits at the kitchen table in a thin robe, hands cupped around a mug, looking at a small stack of scripts with an absent expression. Felicia moves around the house with a quiet competence. She knows how to steer a ship through turbulence without turning the helm into a stage. "You don't have to take that one," she might say, tucking a stray lock of hair behind his ear. "You can say no." But Lemmon, like many actors, measured himself in choices. Saying yes was not merely careerist, it was an attempt to map a porous soul. What he would refuse in private, he sometimes embraced in public because the work allowed him to feel less objectified and more alive. The conversation is quiet. Neither resolves the larger problem of restlessness. They make coffee and eat toast. They worry about their child. They talk about mundane things like the dentist's appointment. It is a scene that could belong to any family, and that ordinariness is the secret of its power. How often do we forget that public figures fall asleep to the same hum of a refrigerator and the same small domestic decisions as we do? A night at the Directors Guild. Picture a black tie night when Lemmon arrives at the Directors Guild. He's in a dark tux, slightly too eager to be polite, saying hello to people with a small stoop to his shoulders as if he's conserving energy for a longer walk. Reporters snap photos. He smiles in that peculiar way, a smile that begins in the eyes and ends in a polite lift of the mouth, and it tells the assembled crowd more than any interview could. During a Q&A, he is asked about his process. He talks about rehearsal, about listening, about how comedy depends on timing and compassion. He mentions, almost offhand, that acting is a way to practice kindness toward imagined people. "You have to believe in them," he says. "Even the fools. Even the liars. Because they are close relatives of ourselves." The line becomes one of those quotes that circulates in anthologies and on placards, but in the room it lands like a benediction. It tells the audience something essential. His art and his humanity were braided. Do you think your work is braided with who you are? Or do you wear your profession like a costume that comes off at the end of the day? On Set with Walter Matthau. Set life with Matthau was simultaneously a war of attrition and a private festival. They teased each other relentlessly, trading insults that looked vicious to anyone unfamiliar with old friends. In one shooting break, Matthau lit a cigar and leaned toward Lemmon. "You know what your problem is, Lemmon," he said. "Enlighten me," Jack replied, playing along. "You're too damned polite." "And you're too damned honest," Jack shot back. They laughed. Then, as if switching the record, Matthau would be the one to offer a hand when the cameras stopped. It was the rhythm of a friendship that could burn bright and then cool down into something rich and steady. What friendships in your life can roast and then restore with equal ease? The weight of applause. There is a special kind of loneliness that follows applause. You can feel connected to hundreds or thousands of people for a brief, bright stretch, and then you are alone again with a car ride home and a suite that looks the same whether you have won or lost. For Lemmon, who loved to be liked but feared being loved for a public image rather than for himself, the applause was a complicated currency. After a successful run, he might walk the streets of New York at night just to feel anonymous for a while. He would sit at a small diner and watch people. From those observations, he learned how to give himself the kind of empathy he had met in strangers. Is there a place you go when you need to be anonymous? Where are you allowed to be just yourself? The long, slow work of repair. Recovery from addiction is not dramatic, clean-cut heroism. It is a long series of small, unglamorous commitments. There are meetings, phone calls, apologies, the patching of relationships. For Lemmon, the work meant saying no sometimes and accepting help when it was offered. It meant admitting vulnerability and making space for steadiness to creep in. Felicia's presence was crucial during those years. She did not save him in a single scene. She saved him through steady days. And that steadiness invites us to reconsider the heroic narratives we tell about recovery. Usually we expect thunderbolts, but often it is the soft rain that causes the green to return. What small acts of steadiness in your life have made the biggest difference? Courage in quiet roles. Actors are often judged by their range, their box office, their awards. But Lemmon's most enduring courage was not a single cinematic stunt. It was the willingness to play small interior roles with the same care he gave to bigger ones. His later work, notably in Glengarry Glen Ross and Tuesdays with Morrie, showed a master comfortable with restraint. Playing decline is a dangerous art because the temptation is to sentimentalize. Lemmon resisted that. He did not demand sympathy, he asked for attention. He invited the audience into the texture of ordinary suffering and ordinary joy. When was the last time you listened to someone who was quietly suffering without trying to fix them? What did you learn? Legacy. What we keep. Legacy is usually measured in obvious things. Awards, money, filmographies. But there is an invisible ledger as well. People remember the way someone laughed, the unsent letter they refused to send, the small kindnesses they distributed without wanting credit. For Lemmon, the ledger is rich. He leaves more than films. He leaves a model of artistry suffused with humility. He leaves friends, family, people who will tell stories about his unpretentiousness for decades. When we think about what we want to leave behind, do we think about applause or about the small, quiet things no camera ever captured? Final scene. A quiet room. Picture the final stage of his life as a quiet room. A couch, a lamp, the muted noise of a television show in the background, Felicia at his side, a child's drawing folded in a drawer, a photograph of him and Matthau in happier times. There is a book on the table. A book about life, perhaps, or a small volume of poetry. He reaches for the book and smiles, the gesture both ordinary and complete. He has been many things. Funny, anxious, brilliant, gentle, exhausted, triumphant. But in the end there is a stillness that is almost like an answer to the question he had been asking all along. Can we still be kind, even when we are broken? He nods, not in some performative way, but in the way a man nods when he has finally been allowed to rest. Epilogue. Questions that stay. The true lesson of Jack Lemmon's life is not a tidy moral. It is a set of questions that hover around us like late light. When we ask performers to give everything of themselves, Do we remember to give them care in return? What obligations do fans and industries have to the human beings behind the work? How do we measure a life? By success, by pain endured, or by tenderness offered? These questions are not meant to be answered neatly. They are meant to be taken with us to the theater of our own lives. So when you watch Lemmon tilt his head in a scene, when you see the slight tremor in his grin, ask yourself, how much of that is performance and how much is truth? And then consider whether you have met anyone in your life who wears a smile as armor. The greatest kindness we can give is not applause. It is the permission to be ordinary, flawed, and deeply loved. Jack Lemmon taught us, through a career of light and shadow, that being human might be enough. This expansion takes the known contours of Jack Lemmon's life and leans into the textures of interior experience. It tries to remain faithful to documented events while imagining the small domestic details that make a life comprehensible. Some scenes are literal. Others are composites meant to illuminate rather than to misrepresent. If you'd like a version that leans more heavily on specific archival quotes, interviews, or documented timelines, I can produce one that annotates every factual claim. Would you like the version with annotations and source notes, or do you prefer this more intimate, narrative rendition?